I would like to extend my warm welcome also to the University of Nottingham, to everyone in this room. My name is Professor Catherine Aideney, and I am the Director of the Institute of Asia and Pacific Studies, an interdisciplinary institute that brings together research on Asia and the Pacific throughout the university. Now, our speaker this evening, Professor Akbar Ahmed, is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at the American University, Washington, D.C., and he's been there since 2001. He's been titled the world's greatest authority on Islam. But we don't just invite distinguished scholars to come and give talks at the University of Nottingham. One of the things that we're very proud of is that we also get practitioners to come and share their real-world experiences with us. And I think it's therefore important to mention that Professor Ahmed is also former High Commissioner of Pakistan to the United Kingdom, and was political agent in more peaceful times, I think, in the South Waziristan Agency in Pakistan, which was in the former Northwest Frontier Province, and also Commissioner of 3 divisions in Baluchistan. And the experience of governing there has informed much of his writing, including his 2013 book with Brookings Press, The Thistle and the Drone, How America's War on Terror became a global war on tribal Islam. Now, he's the author of many other distinguished books, which I do not have time in the short space I have allotted to give you the titles of them all. But they include The Sage Handbook of Islamic Studies, Journey into America, The Challenge of Islam, and After Terror, Promoting the Dialogue of Civilizations. But as a doctoral student in the 1990s, he first came to my attention through this book when I was starting to research Pakistan, Jinnah, Pakistan, and Islamic Identity. And this book was notable through being partially informed through recollections of Jinnah's only child, his daughter, Dina. It was also notable in that it achieved the kind of impact that most academics can only dream of. It led not only to a graphic novel, but also led to a film, which I've had the pleasure of both owning and seeing, a film on Jinnah, where Jinnah was played by the late, great Christopher Lee, something that did not go down too well, actually, in Pakistan itself. His latest work is also linked with a film, A Journey into Europe, a film about Islam in Europe and its place in European history and civilization. And this again will lead to a wider book project, which we publish later this year with Brookings University Press. And this film will be shown actually in Nottingham on the 19th of June at 6:30 at the Refugee Forum on Hunger Hill Road as part of the Nottingham Refugee Week Festival. And if you want to have further details about that, you can come and speak to me after the lecture. And his talk this evening builds on that theme, and I'm sure you will join me in welcoming him to speak on Muslims in Europe, opportunities and challenges. Please, Professor Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Professor Catherine, for those very warm words of introduction. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to this really important session. On behalf of my wife, Frankie Martin, my colleague, we want to express our gratitude to our hosts, Dr. Musharraf and the Karimia Institute, to Dr. John Hoover, the University of Nottingham, and the colleagues who made this trip really so enjoyable and memorable for us. They've been perfect hosts. In fact, we wish to, before doing anything else, pay homage to the best known figure from Nottingham. He took us to Sherwood Forest, and who better than to explain Robin Hood and his symbolism, his cultural symbolism, than this great scholar of Islam. And he portrayed him as a symbol of social justice, fighting against tyranny, and representing human compassion. That's what we are here to talk about. So let me plunge into the ideas that I will share with you this evening. Can you hear me at the back? Thank you. I was in class on 9/11, teaching one of the first classes at American University in Washington, D.C. And as I spoke, one of the planes flew into the Pentagon. And I knew then, as the class disintegrated, that my life would never be the same again. Why? Because I'm a Muslim, I'm a social scientist. I was in Washington, the nation's capital, the capital of the superpower of the world. And I also understood, because I had enough experience of the United States and living in the West and my own country, Pakistan, that the gap that would open up between the West and Islam would take a long, long time before it was narrowed or closed. And I realized that this would be the defining task facing any Muslim living in the West. And it would raise huge questions. It would raise questions about Islam. If Muslims did this in 9/11, we were wondering, how could Muslims do such a thing? How could a religion which preaches compassion and peace and humility do something as blatant as killing 3,000 innocent people? How could Muslims be involved in something so violent which would ruin their reputation, their image? I understood all this on 9/11 in class. And my experience in the field, the professor mentioned, I've been political agent, I've been commissioner, I've been in the field dealing in real life situations. I've been High Commissioner in London, and I knew that this would be something that would involve constant debate, discussion, and particularly initiatives in interfaith dialogue. And since that day, I don't think I've had a peaceful 24 hours. It's just been non-stop. Literally, it's like being on a roller coaster. The White House, the Pentagon, State Department, campuses, traveling, radio, television, films. And as fast as I move, and as fast as friends like Dr. Musharraf move, events move equally fast. So we had the violence in London and in Madrid, and last year you saw Paris and Brussels. So we are seeing two contradictory movements taking place in our times. Those who are promoting peace, bridge building, and those who are committing violence. We hope and we are confident that we will, inshallah, win. Inshallah meaning by the grace of God. And I really am delighted to see so many members of the community, especially the women, and credit to Dr. Musharraf, who I know is working to gather the community. Now, one of the initiatives I took, which I want to share with you and then come to Europe. Yes, so one of the initiatives was a series of very ambitious projects, a quartet in fact, which spanned over a decade. And I took one subject, the relationship between the West and the world of Islam, and I looked at it from 4 different perspectives. And this was a quartet. I'm a social scientist, and this kind of exercise is not frequent in the social sciences. You have, I know the Pro Vice Chancellor is here, he'll recognize books by Lawrence Durrell, the Alexandria Quartet, you have the Raj Quartet, so you have novelists, perhaps more daring than social scientists, but it is really in terms of physical exertion, physical challenges, logistics, almost impossible. But these are desperate times, they call for desperate measures, and I was determined to conduct these projects. So I'm looking at the relationship, this is the core problem, the thesis, relationship between the West and the world of Islam. And everything is up in the air. You have economies that are in trouble. You have high unemployment. You have immigrants arriving. You have asylum seekers turning up. So everything is pushing people into more violent positions than they would normally be involved in. and in a sense pushing politics more and more towards the right, and therefore more and more towards taking positions which are very often hard and unrelenting in terms of foreigners and immigrants. So the first project looked at the relationship from the point of view of the Muslim world. And to add to the complexity of the project, I traveled and conducted the project with my young American research assistants. One of them is Frankie Martin, who was with me from the start, and my wife. So we had females and we had males in the field accompanying me. The idea being that we want a truly representative image of what is going on. I was in Washington and I was watching the news, listening to the news, and I wasn't satisfied. Islam was being depicted in a very simplistic way. Muslims were basically terrorists or ready to blow themselves up when the time was right. This was the simplistic projection of Islam. And of course, every scholar was horrified. Here is a civilization that has given the world great art, architecture, philosophy, medicine. I could go on, and I'll come to that when I talk about Europe. And in the media, it was reduced to this very simplistic projection of a violent religion. And to make it even worse, there was a kind of humiliating humor attached to this description of Islam. So Muslims are supposed to be lusting after these mythical virgins in heaven, 72 or 84. I can never work out the number because the number doesn't exist in the Quran. This mention doesn't exist in the Quran. But this was propagated, so it became the butt of humor, and comedians were quoting it, and ordinary people were quoting it in their commentary on Islam. And I did feel a sense of helplessness. I wanted to understand what was going on in the Muslim world and see for myself. And as witness, take my team with me so that I'd have American students, American assistants as a kind of third eye looking at the Muslim world. And we traveled, we went to the Middle East, to South Asia, to Far East Asia, and we came back with hundreds of interviews. And the first question that we asked people across the Muslim world was, what is it that worries you or agitates you about the West? Why don't you like the West? President Bush is asking, why do you hate us? Why do Muslims hate us? This is the big question Bush asked after 9/11. And the number one answer throughout the Muslim world was that the West humiliates Islam and distorts Islam. And I was surprised because we expected people to say because of Israel or India or Kashmir or Palestine. No, the first answer was the humiliation and distortion of Islam. The second question we asked people was, who are your role models? Who are the iconic figures you respect? Number one, from Turkey to Indonesia, was the Holy Prophet of Islam. So this is telling us something from the field. And we went back to the United States and we told our friends, look, if you want to win hearts and minds in the Muslim world, here are some facts and figures for you. But I wasn't satisfied. So I prepared my team and I said, guys, we've done the Muslim world. This is one half of the picture. We need to find out what the West thinks of the Muslim world, in particular America. So when my sabbatical came up a couple of years later, I took that sabbatical year to travel throughout the United States. We went to 75 cities, went to 100 mosques, again conducting interviews, talking to people, taking notes. We went north, south, east, west, right across the United States. And we talked to every kind of community. The Muslims in the United States are represented by every kind of community, literally Cambodian Muslims and Turkish Muslims and Pakistani Muslims and Indian Muslims. The entire world is in the United States. And again, we found some very interesting things. We found, for example, contrasting to you here in the United Kingdom, that there the community is far less monolithic than here in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it's very simple. The vast majority are from South Asia, the vast majority from Pakistan, the vast majority of that from Azad Kashmir. You can almost bring it down to the district level. In the United States, it's different. The majority is in fact African American. And they were the most interesting part of the study, because they would say, when we'd ask them, why did you convert to Islam? Many of them were converts. And they would say, please don't say we converted to Islam. We reverted to Islam. Because we were originally Muslims. We were brought here as slaves, as Muslims. We were picked up in West Africa and brought in those dreadful slave ships to the United States of America. So they have a memory of being Muslim in their subconscious. And they are incredible as a community. They're proud, they are Americans, they have great pride in being American, and they have great pride in being Muslim. And they produce some great figures, as you know. Muhammad Ali is one of them, Malcolm X is one of them. There are two congressmen, the only two Muslims who are congressmen, who are in fact African American. Here, of course, we know the dominance or predominance of South Asians, particularly Pakistanis in politics, and we of course saw the success of the mayor of London in the recent elections. South Asians were balanced by Middle East in the United States. Now there the problems were very different. There a lot of Americans asked us, they said, who are the Muslims? We don't know Islam. We know very little about Islam. We know very little about your community. Why do they prefer violence? Why do they want to kill us? This question came up again and again as we traveled. One of the problems was that a lot of people would tell me, like if I'm talking to an audience like this, as we did, they'd say, you know, you're the first Muslim we've met. Are all Muslims like you? You seem reasonable enough. Are they all like, and I'd say they're much better than me. They said, no, we don't believe this. They're all crazy, they're ready to blow themselves up. So this was the problem we face. Literally, the very, very few Americans have actually talked to or seen Muslims. Conversely, when we went to the Muslim world, a lot of people had not met Americans or knew Americans. I took Frankie with me to Deoband. We actually went and we were very well received there. The Sheikh Al-Azhar came and met us there, the Grand Sheikh, and he welcomed us. We had lunch. He took us to the mosque, Grand Mosque, and I addressed the mosque. Frankie was with me. He gave permission to him to sit with me in the mihrab as a gesture of respect. Now Frankie doesn't speak Urdu, so he didn't know that the Sheikh was a bit elderly. His finger shook, so every time he'd shake his finger and look at him and say, American. So he thought he was saying, kill the American. And then he'd say, Iraq, Afghanistan, American. So Frankie was getting very, very nervous, and he then whispered to me, he said, should I leave? I said, just sit down, he's welcoming you. Because in fact, the Sheikh was welcoming him. He was saying, welcome, we welcome Frankie, we want to talk about Afghanistan, Iraq, these other issues, but in a civilized way. So that was America, the United States. I still wasn't satisfied. Now those of you who come from countries like Pakistan, understand that society is not a monolith in Pakistan or in Iran or in the Middle East. You have central governments and you have peripheral societies. You have tribal societies. Khan here is from Dir. That's a tribal society. Structures there are different. Leadership is different. Values are different. They're Muslims, but they also have their own customs and cultures. This third study looked at societies that had been overlooked by most Western commentators. And this is an important point I want to share with you, especially those of you who are studying Islam. Western commentators were looking at this through the lens of Islam. So if Islam is the culprit, then we look at the Quran. What is it in the Quran that's promoting violence? And you're off in a different tangent. But if the violence is coming from a specific tribal society, you need to be looking at that tribal society and saying, A, why is it happening? And B, what should we be doing to calm the situation. And here's the evidence. The drone strikes. Take a correlation of the drone strikes. The drone strikes have been conducted primarily in tribal societies. The Pashtun belt between Afghanistan and Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, even among the Kurds, all tribal societies. All tribal societies. First time ever you had a strike in Balochistan, which is also tribal. But so far it's been restricted to the tribal areas and the vast majority in Waziristan, the area that I was in charge of. Now, I've lived in those areas, I've had the privilege of serving those areas, and I can tell you that those are areas that deserve our attention. They deserve our assistance. They deserve to be brought up to the level of the rest of the country. They don't have schools, they don't have water schemes, they need assistance. But what's happening in reality is that the central government and Western powers are in fact hammering them and hammering them further, which means that the young tribesmen growing up in any of these societies, think of it, it's been so many years since 9/11. In any of these societies, a young teenager has seen nothing but war and violence. And as any parent will tell you, war and violence are not good environments to bring up kids. And that's what worries me. I know those people, I've lived there, I've served there. We need to be thinking very radically in terms of incorporating people, not pushing them away. So this third study was the third part. So remember the concept, the theory, Islam and the West. So we looked at it from the point of view of Islam, point of view of the United States. Now the tribesmen, tribal societies. And what emerged was that in fact there's a great deal of tension between the periphery and the central government in that particular country. It has very little to do with the West. It's a tension that has existed for decades, for all kinds of reasons, and I go into it in great detail. In fact, I look at 40 case studies in the book, 40 case studies, right from Morocco up to the Middle East, up to Central Asia, and into the Caucasus Mountains, the Chechen, and all the tribal groups up in the Russian Federation. There was still one point of view that was left out, and that was the European point of view. Now in the United States, by and large, there's a sense that this is the old continent. There's a great deal of affection, but really in a sense, action has shifted. It's all in the United States, and it's basically the United States and the world of Islam. So Europe has very little really to tell us anything. Until I reminded my American friends that they speak a European language, which is English, not American, that their most popular playwright is English, Shakespeare, and that most of the dominant ethnic groups in fact come from Europe, whether they are Scottish or whether they're Irish or whether they are Spanish and so on. So it would really benefit us to examine Europe and Europe's relationship with Muslims. And I can tell you people were not particularly excited. They said, well, he's a professor, professors live in their own world, so let's indulge him. So we came to Greece in 2013. And what we saw in Greece really opened our eyes. We saw the first great wave of immigrants and asylum seekers. And I saw a community which was shaken, in distress, unsure and uncertain. And the Greeks were a very hospitable people, very warm-hearted, hospitable people. They were in their own crisis. They were facing an economic crisis, there was unemployment, the government was shaking, and while we were there, television went off air. There was no money to pay the employees. Now this is the background. And that first wave of asylum seekers is hitting Greece. And we were at the cusp of history, because from then on to now, as you know, over 1 million asylum seekers have landed in Europe. So we began the project, and for the next 3 years, we traveled, we interviewed, and we did the same thing as we did with the other projects. Again, my team consisted of strictly gender balance, So the women would go and interview women and talk to professors or men or whoever they could get information from. The men would go and interview people, professors, scholars, take film footage, and above all, do research. So we were able to move very quickly and very effectively. We went to 50 cities throughout Europe. Again, we went to northern cities, up Edinburgh, up to the north, and right down to the south to Melilla in North Africa, a Spanish enclave, east to west from Cordoba right up to Zante. You may not even have heard of some of these names. You're Europeans, you may not know them. Zante is an entire district in North Greece on the border of Turkey. And it was fascinating. We were meeting communities that people knew very little about. The Turkish community up in Zante, for example, and they all speak Turkish. Like a lot of Pakistanis speak Punjabi or Urdu, that community speaks Turkish. And there you have the same set of problems. Are they Turks? Are they Greek? Are they European? Are they Asian? Same set of questions and debates. Now, there was one point for Europe which did not exist for the United States. We assume very often that the arrival of the immigrants means new citizens of these countries, that they're new somehow. They've just arrived. They're not familiar with us. But what is overlooked is the relationship, particularly in Britain, that Britain had with its Muslim lands. And it goes back 200 years. This is a very important point I'm making, because the United States did not have this relationship. The Germans did not have this relationship. And the French had a very different relationship with Algeria and their Muslim lands, as the British had. The British relationship is deep. It is symbiotic. Let's remember that from South Asia, which is where we come from, you've had Nobel Prizes, writers, novelists in English from the land over there. I grew up in Abbottabad, which again is a town now made famous or notorious, depending how you look at it, from the fact that Osama bin Laden was found in one of the houses and killed there. I grew up there in a school called Burn Hall, run by missionaries, by priests. It's a very famous school. It's produced one of my class fellows became president of Pakistan. One was the ambassador in Washington, and so on. So they produced generals and all kinds of very distinguished people. And we were taught Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley. I knew all about the lines of the Tudors and the Stuarts, etc. So when we came to England, it was a strange country as in the early 60s, but it was a familiar country. And we were very well received because there were many, many English people then at that generation who had actually served in that part of the world and had a great deal of affection. When I came many years later to Cambridge as the Iqbal Fellow, the chair of Pakistan Studies, Sir Nicholas Barrington, who was the High Commissioner from Britain to Pakistan, gave a reception for me. And one of his very good friends was Sir David Lane, who was Home Minister at one stage and Member of Parliament from Cambridge. And Nicholas Barrington is very Asian. He turned to David and said, "David, this man is my friend, look after him." That's all he said. And in a very English way, David Lane became my protector. He would ring up and say, "Look, you're living in the middle of town. My neighbor's leaving for some time. Would you like to move into her house, on rent?" And I said, "David, it'll be interesting, but are there any foreigners there? Are there other Pakistanis?" And I meant people like me, black people. And he said, "Well, there is a foreigner. I think at the bakery there's a Frenchman who works there." I said, "I mean someone like me." He said, no, it'll be very interesting, so please come. And we felt completely at home. Completely, it was a very English neighborhood, suburb of Cambridge itself. I'm pointing out to the fact that you did have these relationships. When I showed my film at SOAS 2 days ago, the Pakistan High Commissioner was there, but so was also Sir Nicholas Barrington. He was in the audience. Now he's not very well, he moves with difficulty, but there he was, very proud to be there, supporting us. So I'm pointing out the links that existed even before the Muslims came to Britain, and it goes much further. So that gave us a clue of how to approach this project. Not blindly as a post-9/11 project, but in the context of history and culture. And very consciously, I approached Europe through the prism of three phases, three distinct phases. The first phase, you could call it the Andalusian phase. That phase begins in 711. Just think of it, 711. We're talking over 1,000 years ago. And it's a remarkable phase. I want the Muslims especially to listen to this. It's a phase when a Muslim, Ibn Firnas, actually flies. He's the first man to fly in history. And those of you who are skeptics and say this is nonsense, it was Leonardo da Vinci or the Wright brothers, just Google him. There's a bridge in Cordoba in the form of wings, named after Ibn Firnas. There's a crater on the moon named after Ibn Firnas. First man to fly, experiment flying. He couldn't quite get the rudder correct, so he had to take a crash dive. But he actually took a plunge. Averroes, Ibn Rushd, was actually the man who introduced Aristotle to Europe. He was so acknowledged as the master of Aristotle that the great Christian theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great figures of Catholicism, would refer to Averroes in his work not by name, but by respect. He would simply call him the commentator with a capital C. That was Averroes, where he balanced faith and reason, where he said, I can be a Muslim and I can be logical and have reason. This was an intense debate taking place in the Muslim world. Ibn Arabi, the great mystic, the great Sufi mystic, again, if you read him today, you'll be amazed at his thought. And then I could go on and on. What is driving these Muslims? Again, I want the Muslims to listen to this very carefully. Life is more than making money. Life is more than materialism. Life is about the way you live and think on this planet. And the Muslim philosophy was driven by the notion of ilm. Ilm, please note this word, those who do not know it, and those who know it, the Muslims, remember this word ilm. Why should you remember it? Because this is the second most used word in the Quran after the word for God. Word for God is used God, 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 God. Second most used word is ilm. Now God could have said power. He could have said sword. He could have said kill them all. He could have said blow yourselves up. No. He said ilm, 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 ilm. And what does the Holy Prophet say? The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. Now I ask you, how can a young man, a Muslim, reverse this saying? How can he say that the blood of the martyr is more sacred than the ink of the scholar? I'll blow myself up. As you're seeing with ISIS and you're seeing with Al-Qaeda and all these militant groups who are causing mayhem across the world. Something has gone wrong in what they're being taught about Islam from their own tutors and masters. I'm giving you the facts on the ground in terms of Islam. So Andalusian Islam came with these ideas, and they created a society which was at the cutting edge of Europe. It was a society 1,000 years in advance of the rest of Europe. You want figures? Here are figures. Cordoba library, main library, out of 93 libraries, had 600,000 manuscripts. The largest library of Europe had 600 books. 600,000, Cordoba, the capital of the Muslim world. The biggest library in Europe, 600. Why? Because the Caliph promoted learning. Learning was a passion. Every Muslim said, I want to learn. Why? Because it's a Muslim duty. The Jews said the same thing. The Christians said the same thing. Why? Because they're living in Andalusia. Andalusia is creating a new kind of society, a society that did not exist in Europe at that time. Perhaps today we are conscious of living in a pluralist society. That's a different time. I'm talking about 1,000 years back. And what is most remarkable is this is not only a Muslim phenomenon. Go further east, and there you have Sicily. Again, we went to Sicily on this travel. And those of you who've been to Sicily and visited the Palatine Chapel of Roger II will be amazed. You go into the chapel, it's one of the most beautiful chapels in Christendom. And you'll be stunned. It's got Islamic calligraphy on the ceiling, on the floors, all across the chapel itself. Roger II, and more striking, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, both spoke Arabic. They had Muslim bodyguards. Their mantle, their royal mantle, imperial mantle, had Arabic script on it. And they would often celebrate the Prophet's birthday or Eid al-Fitr. Just think of what I'm saying. This is the Holy Roman Emperor celebrating the birth of the Prophet. So it's not just a Muslim phenomenon. I'm giving you examples from Christianity. So that is the first phase. Now that phase comes to an abrupt end in 1492 with the fall of Granada, last Muslim kingdom. And the game is over, finished. Muslims expelled, Jews expelled, that door is shut. And for the next few centuries you have the Inquisition. And the game is up as far as this kind of society is concerned, because the church wants a completely monolithic society, so no one is safe. If you say, I'm a Christian, they're not going to believe you. And you'll be tested and maybe found out that you were perhaps Jewish in the previous generation, or you're not Christian enough, and then the Inquisition would do its stuff. So this is feeding into the two big questions we found hanging over the community in Europe. As we traveled in Europe, we discovered that the right-wing parties particularly are asking two big questions about the Muslims. And it's everywhere. It's England, it's Italy, it's France, it's Germany. The two big questions are, or two big observations or points, that number one, Muslims are not European. They're immigrants. They've just come 20 years ago, 30 years ago. They don't speak our language, they don't look like us, they are dirty, they're smelly, we want them out, we don't want them here. And number two, they've contributed nothing to Europe. They're a completely sterile civilization. They have nothing to give us. If you go to Andalusia, both these doubts, observations will be rejected. We have established that Muslims are as Europeans as the Christians who came here just a few centuries before. Remember, I go back to 711. Christianity came just a couple of centuries before. Judaism came not from Europe, it came from the Middle East. Christianity came not from Europe, from the Middle East. Islam came again from the Middle East in 711. So they are very, very much European. And I'm not even quoting the Balkans, where you have Muslim communities living there for 1,000 years. Indigenous Muslims, blue-eyed, blonde Muslims, not immigrants. The second question, civilization. I've given you some examples. I could go on and on of what the Muslims did in terms of contribution. I would urge you, when you're in Spain, just to look at the Granada Alhambra, the palace in Granada. Just to go inside and look, marvel at it. It is the number one tourist attraction of Spain. That's Islam. And again, it's not just architecture. My American team, Frankie Martin, my other American assistants, they were just stunned. They said it's not like any other architecture, because the architect is reflecting the philosophy of ilm. So everything should remind us of the glory, of the wonder of life on earth. Everyone, it's not Jewish, not Muslim, not Christian, not atheist, everyone. So we share our common humanity. It goes back to the Quranic verse that we made you into different tribes and nations so you may know each other, wonder at each other. This is the Quran. We gave you different languages, different cultures. And that is the philosophy captured in Andalusia. On to the second category, so that's phase one. Phase two is the Ottomans. Now with the Ottomans, it's a very different relationship. It's much more of conflict and clash. The Ottomans are an empire, an expanding empire. They're pushing out, they're coming to the Middle East, they're going into the East. In the East, they're blocked by the Safavid, who are Shia. So you have the Persian Empire blocking them. The Ottomans are Sunni Muslims. And their energies then move to the West, into Europe. So many East European countries are then colonized by the Ottomans. And that relationship is a very uncomfortable and even cruel relationship. So memories in East Europe today are sharp about the Ottomans. And if you read the statements of the Prime Minister of Hungary, he makes some very racist remarks. He's referring directly to the Ottomans. When he says, I will not take the Turks into my country, when after what they did to us, he doesn't quite understand that Syrians are not Turks. The refugees are coming, he needs a lesson in geography as much as history, because the Syrians who are coming are victims of violence and the collapse of their own society. They are not Turks coming to conquer East Europeans. But that is the memory, and the basis of Islamophobia is laid then, because Europe then begins to look at the Turks and say, this is Islam. It's predatory, it's violent, and it's coming here. And they're conquerors. They're not coming as the immigrants. They're not coming like Pakistanis coming to Bradford or Leicester to work in some factories in the 1960s. They're coming as conquerors. They actually have the nerve to aim for Vienna, the heart of Europe. Twice they lay siege to Vienna. And in the second siege, they almost get Vienna. And do you know who saves them? They're saved by the cavalry that arrives from Poland. One of the most ferocious cavalry charges of history. The colonel will agree with me from your lessons in military history. It's one of the most ferocious cavalry charges of history. And do you know who's in the vanguard of that charge? It's the Tatars, the Muslim Tatars. So again, it's not West versus Islam. These are Muslim Tatars fighting alongside the Poles because they live there, they share their bread. It's like Pakistani or South Asian Muslims serving in the British Army or the British police. They become part of the culture, and they're as good or even better than any of their colleagues. That's what the Tatars were doing. But that memory remained. So you have phase one, pluralism, culture, creativity. Phase two, barren, conflict, violence, and that image creates the idea of a violent Islam. And it sets you up for the third phase of the European encounter with Islam. The third phase is colonization and immigration, direct relationship. So the British go to South Asia, East Africa, and so on. For us, the South Asian experience is important because there's so many South Asians here. The French go to North Africa. But here's the difference. We often assume, and I know the younger generation of even the English tend to reject everything that happened in the past, but we need to be careful of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. The British come to India, and Macaulay in 1835 establishes his famous minute on education. That changes everything for South Asians, especially Muslims. Language, culture, schools, history, everything changes. In Algeria, the French governor is a military general. His only aim is sheer brute suppression of the Algerians. So you see the difference immediately. Here it's a straightforward military conquest. In India, it's going to become a very conscious attempt to bring a wider civilization to the Indians and giving them a chance. Macaulay's minute, in fact, says precisely that we must try to encourage the Indians to become as much as possible like us. And this is where the genius, and follow this line of argument very carefully. 1857, India erupts and almost topples the British in India. Almost. It's touch and go. The British react with complete brutality. So it's really very bloody on both sides. No credit on either side. But the consequence of 1857 is that Muslims now have to ask themselves, what do we do next? We've lost our empire, the Mughals are gone. We've lost the emperor, he's a prisoner in Rangoon. The elite has gone, they're no longer the elite. The Hindu population has been encouraged. What happens to us? Three responses, two big ones and one adjunct. Deoband responds. There's a new school called Deoband, it's set up, and the founders of Deoband respond by saying Islam is under threat. Islam is being wiped out. So we must defend Islam, create borders around Islam. And they join the mutineers, the so-called mutineers, or the independent fighters, against the British. They fight against the British. Simultaneously, there's another Muslim response, and that is Aligarh. Aligarh College, later university, is set up, and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who sets it up, very consciously goes out to save the British who are now being threatened by the violence in the area. He actually saves some Britishers in his home. So you can see the two Muslim responses. Deoband, protection, Islam under threat. Aligarh, pluralist Islam, we can live in the world, we are Muslims, we are proud of being Muslim, but we have to live in the world. Two responses to the world. This is the most significant point I want to make to you, that Aligarh establishes the conditions for modernist Islam to emerge. And the English guests this evening may wonder very often, how come South Asians have produced Nobel Prizes, Benazir Bhutto, Malala Yousafzai, constantly they're producing squash players, cricketers, Imran Khan, the whole series of things from South Asia. And how come this is not happening elsewhere in the Muslim world? It is precisely because modernist Islam, with all the problems before it, I mean, there are many problems, has taken root in the world today. And I would argue that the very Pakistan movement, Allama Iqbal, Jinnah, Sir Syed Ahmad, all this is one line connecting to South Asians here to the modernist version of Islam. So that Muslims can say, as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan wanted, I am a Muslim, I say my prayers, but I wear a blazer, I wear a tie, I play cricket, I read the Quran, and I can debate in Urdu. That was Aligarh. It wasn't ethnic, so it wasn't a Punjabi school or a Bengali school. So many Pakistani leaders studied there. President Ayub Khan came from Hazara. He was an Aligarh boy. So many of the leaders of India studied there. Of Bangladeshi studied there. So it was creating a universal network of scholars, statesmen, and leaders for the Muslim world with this vision. So colonization, immigration, and different kinds of immigrants. Here in the United Kingdom, we see the impact of modernist Islam. So Muslims are not saying we want to disappear, we don't want to do anything or have anything to do with our host societies. The achievements of the Muslims here and the reception of the hosts, the English, this has been really remarkable. The fact that you have so many mayors and councillors who are Muslim, not only the mayor of London, but so many names. The fact that you have presenters on television speaking very clear English, presenting the news, several of them who have a Pakistani background. At one stage, I think there was a cricket captain who had a Pakistani background. So the people who have done remarkably well in this society. Again, the relationship between colonizer, colonized in the past. Now take a look at France when we say, what's the problem there? What happened in Brussels? What happened in Paris? Analyze this. In France, the notion of someone becoming French doesn't exist. You can have a passport, but the idea of culturally becoming and being accepted is still very, very problematic. And it is problematic because very often Muslims are seen as outsiders. The Song of Roland, and Jeremy, you may confirm this for me. You know the famous song. What do they call them? The geste. What is the expression? Chanson de geste. The first national song of France, in fact, is based on a very famous historical incident. When the Emperor Charlemagne came down south with the idea of attacking the Muslim kingdom in Cordoba, but he didn't. He turned around and started proceeding back to France. And he was attacked by the Basque, who are not Muslim. But in the song written centuries later, it says that the Muslims attacked Charlemagne and the Muslims are very treacherous, they're terrible people, etc. So a fictitious story had been concocted, but that is part of the national cultural symbol of France itself. So if you're a French student in a school and you are learning the Song of Roland, which is part of French culture, French culture and language starts with the Song of Roland, you're going to be very uncomfortable if you are confronted with that song. These are some cultural problems I think we have to be very sensitive to. We are living in multicultural societies, plural societies. We're living in times when we need a lot of understanding, a lot of trust between us, and a time when we must share the richness that each culture brings to this understanding. It is a remarkable era, a remarkable phase of world history. Globalization. Globalization gives you the opportunity to have food from different cultures, to have friends from different cultures, share literature from different cultures. Now this may not be quite true in terms of, again, the contradictions, because globalization is also creating a lot of the problems. Because while there's a very comfortable middle class emerging in many of the so-called developing societies, you also have hundreds of millions of really poor, ordinary people who are not making it, who are struggling. And that is the huge problem that we face today. The poverty, and it's vast, it's uncontrollable almost. A figure that my friend Lord Jonathan Sacks gave me, the former chief rabbi of the UK, that something like 50 people possess wealth equal to about half the world's population. Now, I know that Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all the Abraham, Hinduism, all the great faiths value human life. They value justice. They value sharing with your neighbor. And when you tell me that 50 people equals half the world's population, you immediately tell me there's a huge problem, or there's a huge problem building up. So that's something we have to consider. Now let me draw this to a conclusion. I would say to the Muslim community that considering the reality of living as Europeans, as Muslim Europeans today, they need to be much, much louder, much, much clearer in unequivocally rejecting any form of violence. They cannot be ambiguous. They cannot say yes, yes, but. There are no buts. You cannot kill people, simple. And nothing in the Quran, nothing in the life of the Prophet suggests that you can start killing people. In fact, on the contrary, Islam is very, very scrupulous about this. And this has to be done by the leaders. And I know that Dr. Musharraf and his colleagues at Karimia are working very hard along these lines precisely, because the majority populations are not convinced. They're not convinced. So you need much more activity. You need to be cloned, Dr. Musharraf. You need to be put out there. It is a problem. It's a problem in France, in Germany. The majority population does not believe that Muslims are strongly enough condemning the violence. And they feel that they become ambiguous about it. Muslims have to learn much more about local cultures. They cannot live in cocoons. They're here. In England, they're English, they're British. In Germany, they're German. France, they're French. They must absorb local culture, contribute to it. Bring something to the table. share the links we have. Allama Iqbal from Pakistan, he was at Cambridge University. He wrote a poem on Cordoba. When we called on the mayor of Cordoba, my team and I, people were very gracious to us on this journey, very gracious. Prime ministers, presidents, chief rabbis, everywhere. The mayor of Cordoba was welcoming us very warmly. And my team member pointed out, they said, look behind him. And I looked behind, and it was the poem of Allama Iqbal in Urdu right behind the mayor. And I was very excited. I said, do you realize that you have the poem of Allama Iqbal about the mosque in Cordoba? Because I think the mayor of Lahore had presented it to him, and it's a beautiful silk weaving. It's weaved on silk, beautifully done, like the art of Lahore. Then Allama Iqbal is in Germany, where he's very respected. The chair is named after him. One of the roads is named after him. Imagine a Pakistani has a road named after him in Germany, a very rare honor. All kinds of plaques dedicated to him. So there are links. Build on those links. Build on the links where society feels these are welcome citizens to this country. They're here to stay, and they're contributing. And they can give something in return. We must understand that if the minority has rights, and they certainly have rights that need to be protected, the majority have rights more than the minority, because they are in that land. They are the original inhabitants of the land. You cannot ignore that. And these are little things. Because you're here in a different environment, you're appreciating it, enjoy it fully. No one holds back then. They welcome you. But you cannot have it both ways. And I say this with sincerity, because I've had the unique privilege of having come here in 1961, the first time as an undergrad, and having seen this trajectory of history, as it were, and the different phases of society and the changing relationships. Similarly, Europe's challenge is also, and now I address the non-Muslims in the audience, Europe's challenge is that the notion of racism, religious prejudice, racial prejudice must be challenged unequivocally. We cannot have this kind of situation where a Muslim woman in a hijab is targeted and assaulted or beaten up, or a mosque burnt or firebombed, because this is a slippery slope. I do not have to remind any European that in the last century, precisely this kind of prejudice, I'm not saying circumstances are similar, but this kind of prejudice led to the slaughter and the killing in the concentration camps of millions and millions of a minority religion. Not long ago, not centuries ago, not in the time of the Ottomans, but just half a century ago. So we need to be very careful. It's a slippery slope. Today it's the Muslims, tomorrow it's another community, tomorrow it's another community. And very soon it's Catholics and one form of denomination, another form of denomination. I know it's slippery because back home in Pakistan, this is precisely what's happening. People are killing Shias, they're killing Sunnis, and they're killing Deobandis and Barelvis, and that has come even to the United Kingdom. The leaders of both communities have to be aware of their own societies, and that can only happen if they begin to understand each other. And that is why an exercise like this becomes so crucial. A dialogue like this becomes so crucial, where we can talk as scholars, as neutral, objective commentators, with mutual respect, and try to come up with solutions. I also know that today the media is hostile. Media is hostile, and you have constantly negative portrayals of Muslims. That continues. That's a solution that the Muslim community cannot solve. That's a solution that has to be thought of and has to really be discovered by the majority community. Because if you're going to just think of it, if you're going to constantly project a community in a negative light, a small community, the Muslim community in the United Kingdom may be what? 3%, 4%, not much more. Throughout Europe, it's about this 4%, 3%, 5%, 6%. And if you're going to constantly project it as potential terrorists, as dangerous, as violent, as dirty, smelly, etc., you're going to encourage violence, you're going to encourage prejudice. You're not going to control it then. So we need to learn to respect each other. We need to be able to say, all right, let's find out their culture, their history, their books, their folk tales, what makes them tick. And I promise you, you'll be very pleasantly satisfied and very pleasantly pleased, because history, European history, is rich with the Muslim contribution. At a time when they were heard, when people took them in and said, we will learn from you, not just talk to you, but learn from you. It's amazing the impact that Muslims had in Europe. And what saddens me, because for this journey, we went to the museums in London, and I was amused almost to see the panels of civilizations. You had Greek civilization, Roman civilization, and then for 1,000 years you have the Dark Ages, and then you have the Renaissance, Enlightenment, you're gone. And I said, what happened to the Muslims? They've become the Dark Ages. For that 1,000 years, the Muslims were giving rationality. The Muslims were giving art, medicine, flight, architecture. Do you know that the vast majority of the stars have Arabic names to them? Just check this out. The vast majority. So we need to recognize that that is Islam in Europe. These are European Muslims. They're Europeans and they're Muslims. And it is not the Dark Ages. It is the brilliant age, the golden age. And by the way, Jewish history talks of that time as the golden age, because for Jews at that time it was the golden age compared to what was happening in the rest of Europe. So again, I would like to conclude with a plea for, above all, ilm, which is learning, which is neutral to all of us. We all benefit through ilm. We all are enhanced through ilm. And nothing, I believe, is more relevant to a campus, a university as great as Nottingham, than for us to emphasize the importance of ilm. And then I want to emphasize something that is central to all our faiths, certainly to Islam, and that is the two greatest names of God, Rahman and Rahim, which Dr. Musharraf translates as
most kind, but caring.
Most kind and most caring. Most, I hope it's superlative, most caring. These are the names of God. Now, I ask you, if a Muslim is brought up as a Muslim, believing that God's greatest names are being kind and being caring, how is he going to commit violence? Again, something is going wrong. And that is the problem that Muslims have to encounter and deal with. Not you, not the non-Muslims. And that again relates to our own societies. And Dr. Musharraf, you have to be active in your own societies back home. So that's why I said send one of your clones home so that they can also help them out. I will end with one story, a true story, a historical story. This captures for me the spirit of Islam when it was valid and coherent and confident. Mark my words, confident and coherent in its own identity. This is in Andalusia, the Caliph at Cordoba in his palace, and there's a revolt. And the revolt is of young Muslims who are being educated in Islam, who are called Talib. Ring any bells? So these young Talib say this Caliph must be deposed. We've got to kill this man. He's a corrupt man and he's backed by the Americans or whatever argument they have. So they charge into the palace, and the leader of the Taliban comes with a hatchet, and he comes right up to the Caliph and he almost strikes him when the guards stop him and control him. This is a true story, historical story. And they then are poised to lop the head of the assailant. And they look at the Caliph. And the Caliph says, no, release him. Release him. And they're shocked. They said, but your Majesty, he tried to kill you. And he said he is motivated by the same Quran that has motivated me to forgive him. He's understanding the Quran in one way, I am understanding it in another way. For me, mercy and caring and kindness is Islam. That is a lesson that we as Muslims must need to remember, and non-Muslims need to understand about Islam. Thank you very much. Thank you.